Medium rare, he said without looking up, his voice flat, controlled, like someone used to being obeyed. And don't mess it up like last time. The sentence landed heavier than it should have. Not loud, not aggressive, just precise enough to make the air around table 12 tighten by a fraction. Naomi Carter paused for half a second, her pen hovering above the small order pad, her eyes lifting just enough to meet his reflection in the polished surface of the steak knife resting beside his plate. She had never seen this man before. Not once. And she knew every regular within a 5-mile radius of this place. The low hum of the restaurant carried on around them, glasses clinking, a soft country track drifting through ceiling speakers, the faint sizzle from the open grill 30 feet behind her. But at that table, something fell off, like a note slightly out of tune. Medium rare, she repeated calmly, her voice even, measured, not defensive, not apologetic, just steady. Her fingers tightened slightly around the pad, the edge of the paper pressing into her skin, grounding her. The man finally looked up. Mid-40s, maybe early 50s, dressed plain, dark jacket, no tie, clean but forgettable. But his eyes didn't match the rest of him. They moved too much, taking in everything. The exits, the staff rotation, the way the manager lingered near the bar pretending not to watch. Naomi had seen that look before. Not on customers. On people who were evaluating something. Or someone. You wrote it down? He asked, tilting his head slightly, like he didn't trust the answer he was about to get. Yes, sir, she said, already stepping back, already done engaging. No extra words. No performance. Just work. As she turned, the overhead light caught the stainless steel tray tucked under her arm, reflecting a brief flash across the man's face. Just long enough to show the smallest flicker of surprise before it disappeared again. Naomi moved through the narrow aisle between tables with practiced precision, her steps light but purposeful, weaving past a couple arguing quietly over their bill and a family trying to keep a toddler from knocking over a glass of iced tea. $16 an hour plus tips, and somehow every shift still felt like a test she didn't sign up for. Behind the counter, the kitchen heat wrapped around her instantly, thick and familiar, carrying the scent of butter, char, and something slightly burnt from the last rush. She clipped the order onto the rail without hesitation. Medium rare, ribeye, she called, her voice cutting clean through the noise. One of the line cooks nodded without looking up. Routine. Predictable. Safe. That's how she kept it. But her mind didn't stay there. It stayed at table 12. On the way back to refill waters, she caught it again. That same man, now leaning back slightly, not eating, not checking his phone, just watching. Not her exactly. Everything. The timing of plates. The way another waitress hesitated when a customer raised his voice. The manager stepping in too late. He was collecting something. Information. Patterns. Naomi slowed just enough to notice one more detail. The way his hand rested near the edge of the table, fingers tapping once, twice, then still, like he was measuring patience in seconds. That wasn't normal. Not for someone pretending to be just another guy ordering steak on a Thursday night. As she set down a glass of water at the adjacent table, she felt it again, that quiet pressure in her chest, the same instinct that had kept her steady through worse nights, worse customers, worse situations. Something about him didn't add up. And whatever this was, it wasn't about the steak. The steak hit the grill with a sharp hiss, a burst of heat rising as the cook pressed it down just long enough to seal the surface. The smell of seared meat cutting through the already heavy air of the kitchen, and Naomi stood there for a second longer than necessary, watching the edges curl slightly, watching the juices bead and shimmer under the lights, not because she needed to, but because it gave her a moment to think, a moment to slow the quiet unease that had followed her from table 12. Like a shadow she could not quite shake, and behind her the printer spat out another ticket. Then another, the rhythm of the shift building again. But her focus stayed anchored on that one order, medium rare, exactly as requested, no room for error, not tonight, not with him, because something about the way he had said it, calm but deliberate, kept replaying in her mind. Like he had already decided something before she even wrote it down, and that thought did not sit right with her, not at all. So when the cook flipped the steak and glanced at her, she nodded once, small and precise, as if to confirm that this one mattered more than the rest, and he seemed to understand without asking, because he adjusted the heat slightly, gave it a few seconds more than usual, just enough to hit that perfect balance, and Naomi stepped back, wiping her hands on the side of her apron. The fabric already worn thin from too many shifts that blurred together, late nights, early mornings, tips, that depended more on mood than effort. And still she showed up, still she kept her voice steady, still she carried herself like it mattered, because to her it did, even when no one else noticed, especially then. And when the plate was finally set in front of her, the steak resting at the center, a small cup of butter melting slowly on top, she leaned in just slightly, checking the color, the temperature, the details most people would miss. Then she lifted the plate onto her tray, balancing it with practiced ease, the weight familiar, grounding. And as she turned back toward the dining room, the noise shifted again, louder now. A group at the far table laughing too hard, a glass clinking sharply against another, and near the entrance, her manager, Rick, stood with his arms crossed, scanning the floor with that tight expression he wore when something was not moving fast enough for his liking. His eyes landing on her just as she stepped out from the kitchen, and for a brief second, his gaze narrowed, like he was waiting for a mistake before it even happened. And Naomi kept walking, her posture straight, her steps even, refusing to give him that moment. Not tonight. And as she approached table 12, she noticed the man had not touched his water, not once, condensation gathering along the glass, a ring forming beneath it, untouched, unnoticed, or maybe intentionally left that way. And he was still watching, not just her now, but the entire room, tracking movement, timing, reactions. And when she reached the table, she lowered the plate smoothly in front of him, the soft clink of ceramic against wood barely audible over the music, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, his eyes dropping to the steak, then lifting back to her face, searching, measuring, like he expected something else to happen, something she had not yet revealed. And Naomi met his gaze for just a fraction of a second before stepping back, her voice calm, neutral. "Let me know if you need anything else." And she turned to leave, but not before noticing the slightest shift in his expression, not satisfaction, not approval, something closer to curiosity, deeper, sharper. And as she moved away, weaving back into the flow of the room, she could feel it settle in her chest again, that quiet certainty building beneath the surface. This was not just another table, not just another customer, and whatever he was looking for, whatever he was testing, he had not found it yet, but he would. And when he did, everything in that room was going to change. Daniel Whitmore did not reach for the steak immediately, and that alone set him apart from nearly every customer Naomi had ever served, because most people leaned in the moment the plate touched the table, drawn by the heat, the aroma, the promise of something satisfying after a long day. But he sat back instead, hands resting lightly near the edge, eyes fixed not on the food but on the reflection in the knife beside it, watching the room through a distorted slice of silver. And the seconds stretched just enough to feel intentional, like he was letting something settle before making his next move. And then finally, he reached forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, cutting into the steak with a slow, measured motion, the blade gliding through clean, revealing that perfect medium-rare center, warm pink with just the slightest red at the core. And he paused again, studying it as if the doneness itself held information he needed. And when he lifted the first bite, he did not eat right away. He looked up first, scanning, calculating, his gaze passing over Naomi as she moved between tables, then returning to the plate, and only then did he take the bite, chewing slowly, thoughtfully, as if taste was secondary to whatever conclusion he was building in his mind. And across the room, Naomi kept moving, her tray balanced with 2 iced teas and a plate of fries. Her focus split between tasks, but never fully leaving table 12, because she could feel it, that quiet shift in energy that followed him, the way conversations seemed to dip slightly when he looked up, the way Rick hovered closer than usual, pretending to adjust a receipt, while keeping one eye trained on her section, waiting, always waiting. And Naomi set down the drinks at table 9, offering a brief smile, polite but not forced, before turning back toward the center of the room, her path bringing her within a few feet of Daniel again. And this time, she noticed something new, his phone, placed face down beside the plate, but not idle, the faint vibration of a notification traveling through the wood of the table, subtle but steady, and he did not touch it, not even once, as if whatever was coming through mattered less than what was happening right here, right now. And that was when she knew for certain. This was not a normal night for him, and it was not going to be one for her either. And before she could move past, Rick's voice cut in from behind her, low but sharp enough to carry. Naomi, table 12 better be right. We cannot afford another complaint tonight. And the words were wrapped in something that sounded like instruction but felt like warning. And Naomi turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, her expression calm, her voice even. It is right, she said. Nothing more, no defense, no apology, just a statement. And Rick's jaw tightened for a second, like he wanted to say something else, something heavier, but he held it back, stepping aside with a forced nod that did not reach his eyes, and Naomi moved on. But the tension lingered, stretching thin between them like something ready to snap. And back at table 12, Daniel had finished only half the steak, his fork resting lightly against the plate, his attention no longer on the food at all, but on Naomi again, more directly now, less hidden. And when she returned to check on him, stopping just within reach, her posture open but controlled, he finally spoke, his voice quieter this time, stripped of that earlier edge. You have been doing this long. It was not quite a question, more like an observation he expected her to confirm, and Naomi met his eyes briefly, steady as ever. Long enough, she replied, and the simplicity of it seemed to catch him off guard, just for a moment, because it gave him nothing to work with, no story, no detail, no easy category to place her in, and he leaned back slightly, studying her again, like he was recalibrating, adjusting whatever framework he had built in his mind, and for a second, neither of them moved. The space between them filled with the low hum of the restaurant and the quiet tension of two people who both knew more than they were saying. And then Naomi nodded once, small and polite. Anything else? She asked, and he shook his head slowly. Eyes still on her. Not yet, he said, and as she turned to leave, something in his expression shifted again, deeper this time, like he had just realized the test he thought he was running might not be the only one happening in that room. The plate should have been the end of it, just another order completed, another table cleared, another quiet exchange folded into the rhythm of a long shift. But Naomi felt the moment stretch instead of close, like something unseen had shifted slightly off balance and had not yet settled back into place. And as she moved past table 12 again, carrying a tray of empty glasses, she caught it in the corner of her eye. Daniel Whitmore had not resumed eating, his fork resting where he left it, the steak cooling slowly under the dim amber lights, and his gaze followed her this time. Not hidden, not reflected, direct and steady. And there was something different in it now, not just observation, not just calculation, something closer to recognition, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place, but he was not yet ready to say it out loud. And Naomi did not break stride, did not react, just continued forward, setting the glasses down at the service station with a soft clink that barely registered over the rising noise of the room. But inside, her thoughts sharpened, aligning into something clearer, because she had seen this pattern before, not the man, not the exact situation, but the shift, the moment when someone stopped looking at her as part of the background and started seeing her as something else, something that did not fit the role they had already decided she played. And that was always when things changed, not loudly, not immediately, but enough to alter the direction of everything that followed. And behind her, Rick's voice cut through again, this time louder, less controlled, aimed at no one and everyone at once. We are not slowing down tonight, keep it moving. And a few heads turned, a few shoulders tightened, the staff adjusting their pace without question, because that was how it worked here. Pressure came down, and you absorbed it, kept smiling, kept moving, kept the system intact. And Naomi picked up another tray, her hands steady despite the weight, her mind already mapping her next steps. Table 9 needed refills. Table 14 was waiting on a check, and table 12, that one stayed in the back of her awareness like a quiet signal she could not ignore. And as she passed near the entrance, a cold draft slipped in from the door opening, brushing against her arms, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and asphalt. And for a second, it grounded her, pulled her out of the tight loop of observation and back into something simpler. The physical world, the rhythm of breath, the feel of movement, but it did not last, because when she turned back toward the dining floor, she saw it. A small interaction unfolding just a few tables away from Daniel, a man in a gray jacket leaning too far into his server's space. His voice low but sharp, frustration bleeding through every word, and the young waitress, barely more than a kid, stood there nodding, apologizing for something that clearly was not her fault, her hands gripping her notepad just a little too tightly, and Naomi slowed, just slightly, watching the exchange without stepping in. Not yet, because timing mattered, because stepping in too soon could make it worse, and she knew that from experience. And at table 12, Daniel watched it too, his posture shifting forward, his attention narrowing, and for the first time since he sat down, something in his expression cracked, not fully, not openly, but enough to show that whatever he had come here expecting was starting to collide with something real, something unscripted, and Naomi saw that as well. Saw the way his eyes moved between the struggling waitress and the manager who had not yet noticed, or had noticed and chosen not to act. And that was the moment everything aligned. The tension in the room, the pattern in his behavior, the quiet pressure building beneath the surface of the night. And Naomi made a decision, small on the outside, almost invisible, but deliberate. And as she turned toward the service station again, her hand brushed against the pocket of her apron, fingers sliding inside, finding the folded slip of paper she kept there, blank and used, until now, and she paused just long enough to feel its edge between her fingers, to steady her breath, to anchor the thought that had been forming since the moment he spoke those first words, and then she moved, not toward the conflict unfolding across the room, not toward the manager, but back toward table 12, because whatever this night was building toward, it was not going to resolve itself. And if he was here to test something, then it was time to show him exactly what he had been missing. Naomi approached table 12 with the same steady pace she had carried all night. But inside, everything had narrowed into a single clear line of intention, the folded slip of paper resting between her fingers inside the pocket of her apron like a quiet decision already made. And Daniel Whitmore saw it before she even reached the table, not the paper itself, but the shift in her movement. The way her steps became more deliberate, more precise, as if every inch of distance between them mattered. And he straightened slightly in his seat, his attention sharpening, the unfinished steak in front of him now completely forgotten. And around them, the restaurant continued in its usual rhythm, laughter rising from one corner, the soft scrape of chairs against the floor, the distant clatter from the kitchen. But at that table, something else was building, something quieter, heavier. And when Naomi reached him, she did not speak immediately. She did not ask the usual question, did not check on the food. She simply adjusted the edge of the plate by a fraction of an inch, a small, almost invisible movement, the kind that would not draw attention from anyone else in the room. But Daniel noticed, of course he did, because he had been watching everything. And in that subtle motion, her hand moved with purpose, sliding something beneath the rim of the plate with a precision that matched his own way of observing the world. And for a brief second, their eyes met, not long enough to be confrontational, not soft enough to be dismissed, just long enough to acknowledge that something had just happened between them, something intentional. And then Naomi stepped back, her voice returning to that calm, even tone. Let me know if you need anything. As if nothing had changed, as if this was just another table, another interaction, another moment in a long shift. And she turned, already moving away, already disappearing back into the flow of the room, leaving him with the plate, the silence, and whatever she had just placed there. And Daniel did not move right away, his hand resting near the fork, his eyes fixed on the spot where the plate met the table, because he knew, without looking, that something was there, something he had not accounted for. And that realization alone was enough to hold him still for a few seconds longer than usual, because he was not a man who missed details, not in business, not in life, and yet here, in a place he had walked into expecting control, expecting to measure, to evaluate, to judge, something had slipped past him unnoticed until it was already done, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached forward, not for the steak, but for the edge of the plate, lifting it just enough to reveal the folded slip of paper tucked neatly beneath it. And the movement was small, controlled, but it carried weight, because the moment his fingers touched that paper, the room around him seemed to fade just slightly. The noise dulling, the light flattening, his focus collapsing inward onto that single object, and he unfolded it carefully, the crease opening with a soft, almost inaudible sound, and his eyes scanned the words written inside, and then everything stopped, not dramatically, not outwardly, but internally, like a mechanism he relied on had just encountered something it could not immediately process, and his expression did not change in any obvious way, no sudden reaction, no visible shock, but his jaw tightened just enough, his breathing shifted just slightly, and his eyes, those constantly moving, calculating eyes, went still for the first time since he had entered the restaurant. And across the room, Naomi continued working, refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving through the space as if nothing had happened. But there was a quiet awareness in her posture now, a stillness beneath the motion, like she was waiting without looking, and Daniel read the words. Again, slower this time, more carefully, as if the meaning might change if he approached it differently. But it did not. It only settled deeper, sharper, more precise. And for the first time that night, he was no longer observing the room, no longer tracking the staff, no longer measuring performance or efficiency, because the test he thought he was running had just been turned around on him, and the answer was sitting in his hand, written in ink, undeniable, and somewhere between the weight of those words and the quiet certainty behind them, Daniel Whitmore realized that whatever control he believed he had when he walked into that restaurant, he did not have it anymore. Daniel did not realize how long he had been sitting there until the sounds of the restaurant began to return in fragments, a glass setting down somewhere behind him, a low laugh cutting through the air, the faint hum of the kitchen pushing back into focus. But the paper in his hand held him in place, anchored him to that exact moment where something inside his carefully structured world had shifted, and he read the words again, slower this time, each letter carrying weight not because of what they said on the surface, but because of what they implied beneath it, the kind of implication that did not come from guessing or luck, but from knowing, from seeing something others had overlooked or chosen to ignore, and his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the note, not enough to crease it, just enough to feel its presence, real and undeniable. And for the first time that night, Daniel Whitmore was no longer observing from a distance. He was involved, directly, personally, and that distinction unsettled him more than anything else had so far, because control, to him, had always meant distance, meant clarity, meant being the one asking the questions instead of being handed answers he did not request. And yet here he was, sitting in a dimly lit restaurant with a half-eaten steak growing cold in front of him, holding a piece of paper from a waitress who, by every assumption he had walked in with, should not have known anything beyond taking orders and delivering plates. And yet she did, and that contradiction pressed against his thoughts, forcing him to reconsider everything he had quietly concluded in the past hour. And across the room, Naomi Carter moved through her section with the same calm precision, but her awareness remained tethered to him, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in the subtle adjustments of her pace, the way she timed her movements, the way she positioned herself so that she could see without appearing to look, because she knew what she had done, and she knew what it meant, and she knew that whatever came next would not be small. And Daniel lifted his eyes from the note, scanning the room again. But this time his gaze did not move with the same detached calculation. It searched, more focused now, more intentional, and it landed exactly where she expected it to, finding her near the service station as she refilled a pitcher of water, her posture steady, her expression composed, as if the weight of what she had just placed in his hands did not exist. And that composure, more than the note itself, unsettled him further, because it suggested confidence, not arrogance, not defiance, just quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. And he pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping softly against the floor, a small sound, but enough to shift the attention of a nearby table for a second before it faded again, and he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with purpose, and for a moment, he hesitated, not because he did not know what to do, but because he was not used to being the one stepping into someone else's frame, into their space, into their timing. But then he moved, crossing the short distance between his table and the service station with measured steps, each one deliberate, and Naomi did not turn immediately. She finished pouring the water first, set the pitcher down, adjusted the glasses on the tray beside her, and only then did she shift her attention toward him, her eyes meeting his with the same calm steadiness as before. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the space between them, filled with something heavier than the noise around them, something quieter but more significant, and Daniel held the note loosely at his side, not hidden, not displayed, just present, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, the edge from earlier gone, replaced by something lower, more controlled. "How do you know?" he asked, not specifying what, not needing to, because they both understood exactly what he meant, and Naomi did not answer right away. She let the question sit there, let it settle, her gaze unwavering, her posture relaxed but grounded, and when she finally spoke, her voice was as steady as it had been all night. "Because I pay attention," she said, simple, direct, and it landed with more weight than any long explanation could have carried, because it stripped away everything unnecessary and left only the truth. And Daniel studied her for a moment longer, the silence stretching just enough to feel significant, before he glanced down at the note again, then back at her. And in that exchange, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the noise or the movement, but in him, because for the first time that night, he was not the one in control of the narrative, and he knew it. Daniel did not look away after she answered, and that in itself was new, because men like him were used to breaking eye contact first, used to controlling the rhythm of every exchange. But Naomi Carter stood there with the same quiet steadiness, not challenging him, not yielding either, simply present in a way that made it impossible to reduce her to a role or a title. And for a brief moment, the rest of the restaurant seemed to dim again, not in sound but in relevance, as if everything outside that narrow space between them had been pushed to the edges, and Daniel felt it. That subtle shift, the kind that does not announce itself but changes the ground under your feet all the same. And he glanced down at the note once more, the words now etched into his mind with a clarity that made ignoring them impossible, because it was not just what she had written, it was the precision of it, the certainty, the way it pointed to something specific without hesitation. And he had built his entire career on recognizing patterns like that, on trusting signals others overlooked, and yet tonight, he had walked right past it until she placed it directly in front of him, and that realization pressed against his chest in a way he was not used to, not discomfort exactly, but something close to it, something that forced him to slow down, to reconsider, and he folded the note once, carefully, slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket, not as a dismissal, but as a decision, something he would act on, something he would not forget. And when he looked back up at her, his expression had shifted again, less guarded now, more open in a way that was subtle but undeniable. "You saw all that just from here," he said, his voice lower, more measured, not testing this time, but trying to understand, and Naomi did not move, did not step back or forward, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the service counter, grounding her, and she nodded once, small, almost imperceptible. "You learn to see what people ignore," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no attempt to impress, just a statement of fact shaped by experience. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him quieter than he expected, because that answer did not just explain what she had done, it reframed everything he had been doing since he walked in, every observation, every silent judgment, every test he thought he was running. And for the first time, he saw the gap in it, the blind spot he had not accounted for, the human layer that did not show up in reports or metrics or controlled environments. And across the room, the earlier tension with the young waitress had faded, the man in the gray jacket now sitting back, his frustration replaced with something quieter. But Daniel's attention did not go there. It stayed on Naomi, because the real shift had already happened, and Rick's voice cut in again from behind the bar, sharper this time, edged with irritation. "Naomi, you have tables waiting." And it broke the moment just enough to remind them both where they were, what roles they were supposed to be playing, and Naomi glanced briefly in that direction, acknowledging the call without reacting to the tone, before turning back to Daniel. And for a second, it looked like she might say something more, something beyond the surface of the interaction, but she did not. She simply gave a small nod, professional, composed, and stepped away, moving back into the flow of the restaurant as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just shifted the balance of an entire situation with a single piece of paper and a few quiet words, and Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching her go, not with the detached curiosity he had started the night with, but with something deeper, something that carried weight. And as he turned back toward his table, the unfinished steak still sitting there, the glass of water untouched, he realized that whatever he had come here to evaluate, whatever report he had planned to build from this visit, it was no longer going to look the way he expected, because the most important detail in that room had not been the service, or the timing, or the management. It had been her, and he had almost missed it, and that was not a mistake he intended to make again. The chair legs scraped softly as Daniel sat back down, the sound barely noticeable to anyone else in the room, but loud enough in his own mind to mark the shift that had just taken place. And for a moment he did not reach for his fork, did not touch the steak, did not check his phone. He simply sat there, his hands resting on either side of the plate, his eyes fixed not on the food but on the space in front of him, as if the answer he needed might still be hovering there in the air Naomi had just left behind. And around him the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, plates moving, voices rising and falling, the hum of conversation blending into a constant backdrop that no longer held his attention the way it had before, because now every detail he noticed carried a different weight, a different meaning, and he found himself replaying the last few minutes not as an observer, but as someone trying to understand where he had miscalculated, where the gap in his perception had allowed something so obvious to remain hidden until it was placed directly in his hands, and that realization settled into him slowly, not as frustration, but as a quiet recalibration, the kind that does not resist change but absorbs it, reshapes itself around it. And when he finally reached for the fork again, the movement felt different, less mechanical, less routine, and he cut into the steak once more, not to evaluate it, not to judge the doneness or the seasoning, but almost out of habit, emotion, carried over from a version of the night that no longer existed. And as he took the bite, the taste registered only faintly, because his focus had shifted entirely, and across the room, Naomi moved between tables with the same calm precision. But now Daniel saw more, not just her efficiency, not just her composure, but the subtle choices she made, the way she adjusted her pace depending on the table, the way she listened without interrupting, the way she anticipated needs before they were spoken, and more than that, the way she remained grounded even when the pressure around her increased, even when Rick's voice cut through again, sharper now, directed at another server who had fallen a step behind, and Daniel watched that too, not just the words, but the effect, the way the young server's shoulders tightened, the way the energy around that section shifted slightly, and then he saw Naomi glance in that direction, just briefly, not interfering, not stepping in, but aware, always aware, and it connected in his mind then. The note, her answer, the way she carried herself, it was all the same pattern, the same skill, the same quiet discipline of paying attention where others did not. And he realized something else in that moment, something that settled deeper than the rest. She had not written that note to impress him. She had not done it to challenge him or to gain anything from him. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, because she had seen something that mattered and chosen not to ignore it. And that difference, that absence of self-interest, shifted the entire equation in a way he had not anticipated, because it removed the usual variables he relied on, the motivations he could predict, the outcomes he could control, and for the first time that night, Daniel Whitmore felt something unfamiliar, not uncertainty exactly, but a recognition that the framework he used to understand people did not fully apply here, not to her. And as that thought settled, he reached for the glass of water beside his plate, lifting it for the first time since it had been set down, the condensation cool against his fingers, grounding him in the present moment. And he took a slow sip, his eyes lifting again to find Naomi across the room, not because he was watching her anymore, but because he was trying to understand her. And in that shift, subtle but significant, the entire purpose of his visit began to change, not in a way he could define yet, not in a way he could report or summarize, but in a way that would not allow him to walk out of that restaurant the same person who had walked in. The check sat untouched at the edge of the table, its black leather folders slightly open, the thin white paper inside catching the warm overhead light. and Daniel Whitmore had not reached for it yet. Not because he had forgotten, but because something about finalizing the moment felt premature, like closing a book before understanding the last chapter, and his fingers rested lightly against the table, tapping once, then still. A habit he had not realized he had until now, a quiet signal of thought, of recalibration, and across the room Naomi Carter moved with the same steady rhythm. But the shift between them lingered, subtle but undeniable, like a thread that had been pulled tight and not yet released, and Daniel watched her again, not with the detached lens of evaluation, but with a focus that carried intent, because now there was a question forming, not about the restaurant, not about the service, but about her, about how someone in her position had learned to see what others missed, how she carried that awareness without letting it harden her, without letting it show as anything other than quiet competence. And as he reached for the check, finally opening it fully, his eyes skimmed the total without processing it, the numbers meaningless compared to the weight of what had already passed between them, and he pulled out his wallet, the motion automatic, practiced, but he paused before placing anything inside, his attention shifting again as Rick's voice rose from across the room, sharper now, directed toward Naomi this time. "You are falling behind. I need you to move faster." And the words cut through the noise just enough to draw a few glances from nearby tables before fading back into the general hum. And Naomi did not react the way most would, did not rush, did not apologize. She simply nodded once and adjusted her pace by a fraction, maintaining control without pushing back. And Daniel saw it clearly now, the balance she held, the way she absorbed pressure without letting it define her. And something about that landed differently than everything else he had observed that night, because it was not something that could be trained or measured. It was something built over time, shaped by experience, by necessity. And as that thought settled, Daniel closed the check folder slowly, leaving the bill inside untouched, and he stood again, the movement more certain this time, less hesitation, more purpose. And he crossed the room once more, not to the service station, not to meet her where it was convenient, but directly into her path as she stepped away from table 14, her tray balanced with practiced ease, and she stopped when she saw him, not surprised, not uneasy, just aware, and for a second, they stood there again, the space between them filled with the quiet weight of everything unspoken, and Daniel held the check folder loosely in one hand, the other resting at his side. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone, not questioning, not testing, but acknowledging. "You knew who I was," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization, something he had only just allowed himself to consider fully. And Naomi's eyes held his for a moment, steady as ever, before she gave a slight shake of her head. "No," she said calmly, and then after a brief pause, just enough to let the distinction land, "I knew what to look for." And that answer settled into him with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, because it was not about him specifically. It was about patterns, about behavior, about the kind of awareness that did not depend on titles or appearances. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him quieter than before, as if something inside him had shifted into place, and he extended the check folder toward her, not as a routine gesture, not as a transaction, but as part of something larger, something still unfolding. And Naomi took it without hesitation, her fingers brushing the edge of the leather, briefly before pulling it closer, her movements as controlled as ever. And as she turned to process it, Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching her, not with curiosity now, but with recognition, because somewhere between the note, the conversation, and the quiet way she carried herself through everything the night had thrown at her, he had come to understand something he had not expected to find. And as he stepped back, giving her space, the noise of the restaurant returning around him, it was clear that whatever had begun as a simple visit, a quiet evaluation, had already become something else entirely, something that would not end when he walked out that door. Naomi stood at the small terminal near the service station, the soft glow of the screen reflecting faintly against her face as she opened the check folder and entered the payment, her fingers moving with quiet precision over the worn keys, each tap controlled, deliberate. And behind her the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, but the moment between her and Daniel Whitmore lingered like a quiet echo that had not yet faded. And she could feel it, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as awareness, the kind that sharpened everything just slightly, made every movement more intentional. And as the receipt printed with a soft mechanical hum, she paused for a fraction of a second before tearing it free, her eyes lowering briefly to the numbers, then lifting again toward the floor, locating him without searching, because she already knew where he would be, standing near his table, not seated, not settled, waiting. And that detail alone told her more than anything he had said, because men like him did not wait unless something mattered. And she closed the check folder, smoothing the edge with her thumb before stepping away from the terminal, her posture straight, her pace even, carrying the same composure she had held all night. But inside, there was a quiet shift, not uncertainty, not hesitation, just a recognition that whatever had started between them had not reached its end yet. And when she reached him, she extended the folder back with a small, professional motion, her fingers releasing it the moment it transferred into his hand. And for a second, neither of them spoke, the noise of the room folding around the silence between them. And Daniel took the folder, opening it slowly, not to check the total, not to confirm the transaction, but to see what he had already decided to do. And inside, the receipt sat neatly in place, and beneath it, the card he had used. And he pulled it free with the same measured precision he had carried all night. But this time, there was no distance in it, no detachment, just intention, and he reached into his pocket again, not for his wallet, but for something else, something smaller. And Naomi noticed it without looking directly, the subtle shift of his hand, the change in his posture, the way his attention focused inward for a brief second before returning to her. And when he placed the contents back into the folder, he did it carefully, aligning everything with a precision that mirrored her own earlier movement with the plate. And then he closed it, holding it for a moment longer than necessary before extending it back toward her. And when she took it, their fingers brushed lightly for just a fraction of a second, not enough to linger, but enough to register, and she stepped back, opening the folder again as part of the routine, her eyes dropping to the receipt. And that was when she saw it, not just the signature, but the name, written clearly, deliberately, not hidden, not abbreviated. Daniel Whitmore. And for the first time that night, her expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to see. A brief flicker of recognition passing through her eyes before settling back into composure. And beneath the name, the tip, far beyond what the meal required, far beyond what the moment demanded. But it was not the amount that held her attention. It was what sat just below it, a second line, written in the same controlled hand, "Come see me," followed by an address she recognized not from personal experience, but from headlines, from the quiet knowledge of the city's power structures, the kind of place people did not casually invite others into. And Naomi closed the folder slowly, her thumb pressing lightly against the edge as she lifted her gaze back to him. And Daniel was watching her, not with expectation, not with assumption, but with something steadier, something that left the decision entirely in her hands. And for a moment, the space between them held that possibility, open, undefined, and Naomi felt it, the weight of what was being offered, not just an opportunity, not just a conversation, but a shift, a doorway into something larger than the routine she had built her life around. And yet, as she stood there, the sounds of the restaurant grounding her, the clink of dishes, the murmur of voices, the familiar rhythm that had shaped her days, she did not rush to respond, did not let the moment pull her forward. She simply met his gaze, steady as ever, and gave a small, controlled nod, not agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement. And in that quiet exchange, something settled between them, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, because whatever came next would not be decided in that room, but it had already begun. Daniel did not leave right away, and that alone said more than anything he could have spoken, because men in his position, men who lived by schedules measured down to the minute, did not linger without reason. And yet he stood there beside the table, the empty plate pushed slightly aside, the faint scent of seared steak still hanging in the air, his jacket resting perfectly in place as if the rest of the world had not shifted at all. But inside, something quiet and precise that he could not ignore. And Naomi Carter felt it too, not through words, not through gestures, but through the stillness that settled between them, a stillness that did not belong in a room built on movement and noise. And she held the check folder close to her side for a moment longer than necessary before turning away, stepping back into the rhythm of her shift, because that was what she knew, what she controlled, what she trusted, and behind her, Daniel finally moved, not toward the exit immediately, but back to his chair, his hand brushing lightly against the backrest as if grounding himself in something physical before making his next decision. And he sat for just a second, not to rest, not to reconsider, but to observe one last time, to take in the room with a different lens than the one he had walked in with. And now every detail carried new meaning. Rick's posture behind the bar, tight, watchful. The young waitress at the far table moving faster than before, her movements slightly less steady under pressure. The subtle way customers responded to tone, to attention, to presence. And at the center of it all, Naomi, moving through it with a consistency that did not break, did not waver. And Daniel realized then that what he had witnessed was not a moment, not a performance, but a pattern, something she carried into every interaction, every decision. And that realization settled deeper than the note, deeper than the conversation, because it could not be dismissed or explained away. It simply was, and he stood again, this time without hesitation, his path clear now, and he reached into his pocket briefly, not for the note, but to confirm its presence, a small, grounding action that connected the beginning of the night to where he stood now. And then, he turned toward the exit, his steps measured, controlled, but carrying a different weight than when he had first walked in. And as he passed the service station, Naomi did not look up immediately. She finished placing a stack of clean glasses in order, aligning them with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else. And only then did she lift her gaze, catching his movement just as he reached the door, and for a brief second, their eyes met across the distance. No words, no gestures, just recognition. And Daniel gave the smallest nod, not formal, not performative, just acknowledgement, before pushing the door open, the cool night air slipping in as the hinges moved, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and distant traffic. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, the sound blending back into the steady rhythm of the restaurant as if nothing had changed. But Naomi stood there for a moment longer than usual, the check folder now set aside, her hands resting lightly against the counter, her breathing steady, her expression composed. And yet beneath that surface, there was a shift, not excitement, not uncertainty, but awareness, the kind that comes when a moment passes that cannot be undone, that cannot be ignored. And Rick's voice called out again from behind her, sharper, impatient, pulling her back into the present. Naomi, I need you on table 6, and she nodded once. Already moving, already stepping back into the flow, because the night was not over, the work was not done, and whatever had just begun would have to wait. But as she picked up her tray and moved toward the next table, her mind did not drift, did not replay the moment. It simply held it, steady, like a quiet piece of truth she would return to when the noise faded, and somewhere outside, beyond the glow of the restaurant lights, Daniel Whitmore stepped into the night with a decision already forming. One that had nothing to do with the report he had planned, nothing to do with the metrics he had come to measure, but everything to do with a waitress who had seen what he had missed and refused to stay silent about it. The night did not end with anything dramatic, no sudden silence, no final moment that marked a clear divide. Instead, it faded the way long shifts always did, gradually, table by table, plate by plate, until the noise softened into something manageable, something quieter, and Naomi Carter moved through the closing routine with the same steady rhythm she had carried all evening, wiping down surfaces, stacking chairs, aligning silverware with careful precision, each motion deliberate, controlled, and free of distraction. But beneath that surface, the awareness remained, not loud, not demanding, just present, like a thread woven into the fabric of everything she did. And across town, Daniel Whitmore sat in the back of a car that moved smoothly through the dim glow of streetlights, the city passing by in quiet reflections against the tinted windows, his posture composed, his hands resting lightly in his lap, but his mind far from still, because the note was still there, folded neatly in his pocket, its presence more significant now than it had been when he first read it. And he reached for it again, not out of habit, but out of necessity, unfolding it under the soft interior light, his eyes scanning the words with a different understanding than before, because now he had context. Now he had seen the environment it came from, the people, the patterns, the small details that had confirmed what she wrote. And it was no longer a possibility, it was a fact, and his thumb pressed lightly against the edge of the paper as he considered what it meant, not just for his company, not just for the internal issues she had pointed out, but for everything else he had overlooked by focusing only on systems and results. And the driver's voice broke through gently from the front seat, asking a simple question about direction, and Daniel answered without hesitation, his tone calm. But the destination he gave was not the one originally planned. It was the address he had written down earlier, the location tied directly to the name she had pointed out, and the car adjusted course without question, turning onto a quieter street, the motion smooth but decisive. And back at the restaurant, Naomi finished her final task, placing the last set of clean glasses into their proper place, her hands pausing for a brief second against the cool surface of the counter, the stillness settling around her as the remaining staff moved through their own routines, the energy of the night finally releasing its hold, and she reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the empty space where the folded paper had been earlier, and for a moment, she simply stood there, not thinking ahead, not replaying the night, just present in the quiet that followed it. And then she exhaled slowly, grounding herself before stepping away, removing her apron and folding it neatly, placing it in the designated space with the same care she gave everything else, because no matter what had shifted, no matter what had begun, her discipline did not change. And outside, the night air was cooler, carrying a faint trace of rain, the pavement reflecting the streetlights in soft, uneven patterns, and she stepped into it without hesitation, her pace unhurried, her posture steady, as if the world beyond the restaurant had not changed at all. And yet somewhere across the city, Daniel Whitmore stood in a building far removed from the quiet routine she had just left behind, his presence altering the atmosphere the moment he entered, not through force, not through volume, but through the weight of authority that followed him. And the man Naomi had written about, the one who had gone unnoticed by everyone else, now stood under that attention, the kind that did not miss details, the kind that did not accept easy explanations. And Daniel listened, not interrupting, not revealing everything he knew, but guiding the conversation with the same precision he had used all his life. Except now there was a difference. Now there was a layer of awareness he had not carried before, because this time, he was not just relying on reports or assumptions. He was following something real, something observed by someone who had nothing to gain from pointing it out. And as the conversation unfolded, as the truth began to align with what had been written on that small piece of paper, Daniel felt the shift complete itself, the decision solidifying into action. And in that moment, the distance between a quiet waitress in a modest restaurant and a man who controlled entire systems of power no longer felt as wide as it once had. Because what connected them was not status or position, it was clarity, the ability to see what mattered and act on it. And as the night moved forward, carrying both of them in different directions, the impact of that connection settled into place, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that would not fade. Because some moments do not announce their importance when they happen. They reveal it in what comes after, in the decisions made, in the changes that follow, and this was one of them. Morning light settled differently than the night before, softer, quieter, stretching across the city in long, pale lines that reflected off glass and pavement. And Naomi Carter stood outside the same restaurant hours later, her jacket pulled close against the early chill, her breath steady, her posture unchanged, because routine did not bend easily, not even after a night that had shifted something beneath the surface. And inside, the chairs were still stacked, the lights dimmed low, the space waiting to be filled again with noise and motion. But she did not go in right away. She stood there for a moment longer, her eyes resting on the door as if measuring the distance between what had been and what might come next. And then she reached into her pocket, not for anything specific, just a habit, a grounding motion, and her fingers brushed against nothing. The space where the folded note had once been now empty, and she exhaled slowly, not as a release, but as acknowledgement, because some things were not meant to be held onto. They were meant to move forward. to create something beyond themselves, and across the city, in a building that rose far above the quiet street she stood on. Daniel Whitmore stood at the head of a long table. The morning meeting already underway, his presence controlled, his voice steady, but the atmosphere in the room carried a different weight than it had before, because this time, the conversation was not guided by reports alone, not shaped by filtered data or polished summaries. It was grounded in something direct, something undeniable, and as he spoke, the room listened differently, not because of authority alone, but because of the clarity behind his words. And the man Naomi had written about sat further down the table, his posture no longer as confident as it had been in previous meetings, his responses measured, cautious, as the gaps in his explanations became harder to ignore, and Daniel did not raise his voice, did not press aggressively. He simply asked the right questions, the kind that left no space for evasion, and one by one, the pieces aligned, the truth revealing itself not through confrontation, but through precision. And when the meeting ended, the outcome was clear without needing to be announced, the shift already set in motion, and Daniel remained at the table for a moment longer after everyone else had left, his hands resting lightly against the polished surface, his gaze distant but focused, because this was not just about correcting a mistake. It was about something deeper, something he had almost overlooked entirely. And later that day, Naomi moved through another shift, the rhythm familiar, the motions unchanged, but there was a difference now, not in how she worked, not in how she carried herself, but in the quiet awareness that followed her, the understanding that what she had done had mattered beyond that room, beyond that moment. And as she cleared a table near the window, the afternoon light catching against the glass, she noticed something placed neatly at the edge, a small envelope, unmarked except for her name written in the same controlled hand she had seen before, and she paused for just a second, her fingers hovering above it before picking it up, the paper smooth, deliberate, and she did not open it right away. She simply held it, feeling its weight, grounding herself in the moment before allowing it to unfold, and when she finally did, the contents were simple, a card, heavy stock, clean design, bearing Daniel Whitmore's name and title, and beneath it, a short line written by hand. There is a place at the table for people who see what matters, followed by a time, a location, not a demand, not an expectation, just an invitation, and Naomi read it once, then again, not searching for hidden meaning, but letting the words settle, and she closed the envelope slowly, her thumb pressing lightly against its edge as she looked out through the window, the city moving beyond the glass, steady, constant, and for a moment, she did not decide, did not rush forward or step back. She simply stood there, present in the space between what she knew and what was possible, and then she placed the envelope carefully into her pocket, not as acceptance, not as rejection, but as something she would carry with intention. And as she turned back to her work, the rhythm of the restaurant continuing around her, there was a quiet certainty in her movement, not about what she would choose, but about who she was, because whatever table she stood at, whatever room she walked into, that part would not change. And somewhere above the city, Daniel Whitmore looked out over the skyline. The same steady gaze he had carried into every decision now anchored by something new, something grounded not in power, but in clarity, and though neither of them spoke it, neither of them needed to, the connection between them remained, not as a moment that had passed, but as something that would shape what came next, quietly, steadily, and without needing to be announced.